You're standing in Washington, D.C. on August 24, 1814, and the city is burning. The White House, the Capitol, the Treasury. Everything that represents American independence is engulfed in flames as British forces march through the streets unchallenged. President James Madison has fled, Dolly Madison has grabbed what she could and run, and the most powerful military on earth is systematically destroying the symbols of American democracy. This is the moment when the United States of America could have ceased to exist as a functioning nation, when the War of 1812 could have ended in total humiliation and the recolonization of a broken republic. But here's what they don't teach you in history class, what gets conveniently left out of the textbooks and the documentaries about the burning of Washington. The reason the British didn't push further, the reason they couldn't consolidate their victory and march into Baltimore to complete the destruction of American sovereignty, comes down to a single regiment of soldiers who stood their ground when everyone else had abandoned the fight. And every single one of them was black. Let that sink in for a moment. While the white militias fled in panic, while professional American soldiers scattered in what became known as the Bladensburg races because they ran so fast from the British advance, while the government itself evacuated and left the capital to burn, there was one group of men who refused to break, who held their position against overwhelming odds, who fought with such ferocity and discipline that they gave America the time it desperately needed to regroup and survive. Their names have been erased from the popular narrative of American heroism, their sacrifice minimized or ignored entirely, but without them, there might not be a United States of America as we know it today. This is the story of the Black Regiment that saved Washington, D.C., and it's time you knew the truth about who really defended American independence when it mattered most. The War of 1812 is often called America's Forgotten War, but for the young nation, it was an existential crisis that threatened everything the Revolution had achieved. Britain, fresh from battling Napoleon across Europe, turned its full attention to its former colonies with a simple goal: humiliate the United States, destroy its capacity to function as an independent nation, and demonstrate to the world that American independence was a temporary aberration that could be reversed. By the summer of 1814, British strategy had crystallized into a devastating plan. Attack Washington, D.C. itself, burn the capital to the ground, and decapitate the American government in a single bold stroke. The psychological impact would be catastrophic. If Britain could torch the very seat of American power with impunity, what hope did this upstart nation have of defending itself? The British assembled a force of 4,500 veteran troops, men who had fought against Napoleon's armies, seasoned warriors who knew how to move fast and strike hard. Under the command of General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn, they sailed up the Chesapeake Bay and landed at Benedict, Maryland, on August 19, 1814. Their destination was clear, their intent obvious, and the American response was chaotic, disorganized, and desperately inadequate. President Madison scrambled to assemble a defensive force, pulling together about 7,000 men. Mostly militia, mostly untrained, mostly unprepared for what was coming. The stage was set for one of the most humiliating defeats in American military history, but also for one of its most overlooked acts of heroism. August 24, 1814, Bladensburg, Maryland, just a few miles from Washington, D.C. This is where American forces made their stand, and this is where everything fell apart. The Battle of Bladensburg lasted roughly 2 hours, but for the Americans, it felt like an eternity of terror and confusion. The white militia units, seeing the disciplined British regulars advancing with fixed bayonets, broke almost immediately. They fired a few scattered volleys, then turned and ran. Not in an organized retreat, but in full panic. American soldiers threw down their weapons, abandoned their positions, and fled so quickly that British officers were actually surprised at how easy their victory was coming. The roads back to Washington became clogged with running soldiers, abandoned equipment, and officers who had completely lost control of their men. President Madison himself, who had ridden out to observe the battle, had to flee on horseback as the American lines collapsed around him. It was a disaster, a complete breakdown of military discipline and courage, and it opened the road to Washington for the British forces who could barely believe their good fortune. But there was one unit that didn't run, one formation that held its ground even as the entire American defensive line disintegrated around them. They were positioned at the crucial point where the road to Washington crossed the Eastern Branch Bridge, and they were commanded by Captain David Porter of the United States Navy, and they were black. Now, you need to understand something about black military service in 1814 America. This was a nation where slavery was legal, where black people were considered property in much of the country, where the very idea of armed black men in uniform terrified many white Americans more than the British Army did. The irony is almost too painful to bear. Here was a country fighting for its independence and sovereignty, claiming to represent freedom and democracy, while simultaneously enslaving millions of people based on the color of their skin. Yet from the very beginning of the War of 1812, black Americans had volunteered to defend this imperfect nation, hoping that their service might earn them respect, recognition, or even freedom. Some were free black men from northern cities, some were enslaved men promised freedom in exchange for military service, some were sailors who had served in the Navy where racial lines were slightly less rigid than in civilian life. They had already proven themselves in naval battles on the Great Lakes, in privateering operations along the coast, in small unit actions that rarely made the newspapers. But at Bladensburg, they were about to prove something that would shake the foundations of American racial assumptions, even if that proof would later be buried and forgotten by a nation uncomfortable with the implications. Captain Porter's unit consisted of approximately 500 black sailors, Marines, and flotilla men, naval personnel who had been hastily organized into a defensive force when it became clear the British were advancing on Washington. These weren't raw recruits or untrained militia. Many were veterans of naval combat, men who knew how to stand under fire, who understood discipline and tactics, who had faced death before and hadn't flinked. They were armed with muskets, supported by a few small artillery pieces, and positioned at the most critical defensive point on the battlefield. When the British advance began, when the American militia started to crumble and flee, Porter's Black Regiment received orders that were essentially a death sentence. Hold that bridge, hold that position, hold it no matter what, because if the British break through here, Washington falls tonight. And they held. As white soldiers ran past them in panic, as officers abandoned their posts, as the entire American defensive strategy collapsed into chaos, these black sailors and Marines stood their ground and fought. They fired disciplined volleys into the advancing British columns. They reloaded under fire. They held their formation even as British artillery shells exploded around them and British infantry surged forward with bayonets fixed. For precious minutes that stretched into an hour, they contested every foot of ground, making the British pay in blood for their advance. The British weren't expecting this kind of resistance. Their intelligence had told them the American forces were largely militia, unreliable and prone to breaking under pressure, which had proven accurate for most of the American line. But this unit, this Black Regiment holding the bridge approach, was fighting like regulars, like professionals, like men who had something to prove and everything to lose. British officers later recorded their surprise in after-action reports, noting the fierce resistance they encountered from what they initially dismissed as colored troops. The black soldiers fired, fell back in good order, established new defensive positions, and fired again. They used the terrain, they supported each other, they maintained discipline even as casualties mounted and the tactical situation became increasingly desperate. Captain Porter, observing their conduct under fire, was witnessing something that challenged every racist assumption of his era. These men were fighting as well as or better than any white troops he had commanded, and they were doing it in circumstances that would have broken less determined soldiers. The battle raged for over an hour at the bridge position, with the Black Regiment trading volleys with British regulars who outnumbered them and outgunned them. They couldn't hold forever, no unit could against such overwhelming force, but they didn't need to hold forever. They needed to hold long enough. Here's what Porter's Black Regiment accomplished in that desperate hour of fighting at Bladensburg. First, They delayed the British advance on Washington by at least 60 to 90 minutes, time that proved absolutely crucial for evacuating government documents, art, and personnel from the capital. Without that delay, the British would have captured not just buildings but people, members of Congress, cabinet officials, potentially even President Madison himself if his escape had been cut off. The psychological and practical impact of capturing the American government would have been devastating, potentially fatal to American morale and war effort. Second, they inflicted significant casualties on the British advance, bloodying elite troops and demonstrating that American forces could fight effectively when properly led and motivated. The British had expected a walkover. Instead, they got a battle. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they preserved American honor at a moment when honor seemed lost. The Battle of Bladensburg went down in history as a humiliating defeat, nicknamed the Bladensburg Races because of how fast American militia ran away. But buried in that defeat was a story of courage and determination that contradicted the narrative of American cowardice. Finally, when the order came to fall back, because the position was no longer tenable, because staying meant annihilation, Porter's Black Regiment withdrew in good order, maintaining their formation, covering each other's retreat, still fighting as they fell back toward Washington. They didn't rout, they didn't panic, they didn't throw down their weapons and flee. They retreated like soldiers, maintaining discipline to the end. The British entered Washington, D.C. that evening and began the systematic burning of government buildings. The White House was torched, the Capitol was set ablaze, the Treasury, the War Department, the Arsenal, all put to the flame in an orgy of destruction designed to humiliate America and demonstrate British power. Admiral Cockburn personally supervised the burning, allegedly sitting in President Madison's chair in the White House dining room and toasting the Prince Regent before ordering the building's destruction. For Americans, it was a national nightmare, the ultimate symbol of defeat and vulnerability. But the British didn't stay long. They couldn't. The delay at Bladensburg, the resistance they had encountered, the casualties they had suffered, all of it had slowed their momentum and given American forces time to regroup. More importantly, the British advance on Baltimore, which was supposed to follow quickly after the destruction of Washington, now faced a city that had been warned, had prepared defenses, and was ready to fight. The Battle of Baltimore, which followed in September 1814, ended in British defeat. Their ground assault was repulsed. Their naval bombardment of Fort McHenry failed to reduce the fort or break American will, and the sight of the American flag still flying over Fort McHenry the morning after the bombardment inspired Francis Scott Key to write what would become the national anthem. But Baltimore had time to prepare because of Bladensburg, because of the delay, because of Porter's Black Regiment standing their ground when everyone else ran. Now here's where the story gets even more painful. After the war, when America was writing the narrative of its survival and near defeat, when historians and politicians were crafting the story of American courage and resilience in the War of 1812, the role of black soldiers was systematically minimized, ignored, or erased entirely. The Battle of Bladensburg was remembered as a humiliating defeat, the burning of Washington as a national tragedy, and the Battle of Baltimore as a redemptive victory, but the Black Regiment that had held the line at the most critical moment was written out of the story. Captain Porter did mention their service in his reports, praising their courage and discipline, but those reports gathered dust in archives while popular histories focused on white heroes and white narratives. The few contemporary accounts that acknowledged black military service often did so grudgingly, unable to reconcile the evidence of black courage and competence with the racist ideology that underpinned American slavery. Some accounts tried to credit white officers exclusively for any success, as if the black soldiers were merely following orders rather than making conscious choices to stand and fight when flight was an option. Other accounts simply ignored the racial composition of units entirely, allowing later generations to assume all American defenders were white by default. The erasure was systematic, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. But the impact of that stand at Bladensburg rippled far beyond the immediate military situation. black soldiers had proven something that terrified pro-slavery advocates and inspired abolitionists. They could fight well, and they could fight for a nation that oppressed them, hoping their service would earn them dignity and freedom. In the years after the War of 1812, the memory of black military service would be invoked by those arguing for emancipation, for civil rights, for the recognition of black humanity and equality. Frederick Douglass would later point to black service in American wars as irrefutable proof that black men deserved full citizenship and equal rights. How could you deny rights to men who had bled and died defending the nation? The pattern would repeat in the Civil War, when black regiments like the 54th Massachusetts would prove their courage at battles like Fort Wagner, fighting for a union that had long denied them freedom. It would repeat again in World War I, when black soldiers of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, would spend more time in combat than any other American unit and win numerous French military honors while facing discrimination from their own army. It would repeat in World War II, when the Tuskegee Airmen and Black Tank Battalions and infantry divisions would distinguish themselves in combat while still facing segregation and prejudice. And at the root of all of it, back at the beginning of this pattern of black military excellence and national ingratitude, there was Bladensburg, there was that bridge, there were those 500 men who stood their ground when Washington was burning. Let's talk about what freedom meant to these men, because it's crucial to understanding why they fought. For the enslaved black men who served in Porter's unit and other military formations during the War of 1812, military service often came with a promise: fight for America, and America will grant you freedom. It was a bitter bargain, being asked to risk your life defending a nation that had stolen your freedom in the first place. But for many enslaved people, it was the only path to liberty available. Some were manumitted by their enslavers specifically to serve in the military. Some were promised freedom after the war. Some simply took advantage of wartime chaos to escape bondage and enlist. The tragedy is that America often failed to honor these promises. After the war, many black veterans found themselves fighting legal battles to secure the freedom they had been promised, facing enslavers who claimed they had never agreed to manumission, encountering courts that sided with white property owners over black veterans. Some black soldiers who had risked everything for American independence ended up back in slavery because the nation they defended decided property rights mattered more than promises made to black men. For the free black men who served, the motivations were different but equally complex. They fought hoping to prove their worth as citizens, to demonstrate that black Americans deserved equal rights and respect, to earn through battlefield courage what they were denied by law and custom. They fought because they hoped America could become what it claimed to be, a nation of liberty and equality, and they believed their service might push the nation closer to that ideal. They fought because, despite everything, this was their country too, their home, their future, and they refused to let it fall without a fight. The weapons these black soldiers carried at Bladensburg were mostly smoothbore muskets, likely .69 caliber flintlocks similar to those used by most American forces at the time. These were inaccurate weapons by modern standards, effective only at relatively short ranges, requiring considerable training to use effectively in the chaos of battle. Loading and firing required discipline. Pour powder down the barrel, insert wadding, ram the ball home, prime the pan, aim, fire, repeat under fire while men around you are being hit and falling and while enemy soldiers are charging toward you with bayonets. The fact that Porter's Black Regiment maintained the fire discipline to execute multiple volleys in combat conditions speaks to their training, their courage, and their determination. They would have been supported by a few small artillery pieces, probably 3 or 6 pounders, cannon that fired solid shot or grape shot at advancing infantry. Artillery crews were specialized, requiring training and coordination, and the black sailors manning these guns performed as well as any white artillery crews in the American Army. They fired, reloaded, adjusted their aim, and fired again, working the guns in the disciplined rhythm that separates professional artillery from amateur cannon crews. Their effectiveness forced the British to deploy their own artillery and infantry in organized assaults rather than simply walking through American positions as they had elsewhere on the battlefield. The aftermath of Bladensburg and the burning of Washington led to intense soul-searching in American leadership. How had the capital been left so vulnerable? Why had American forces performed so poorly? What needed to change to prevent future humiliations? But conspicuously absent from most of these discussions was any serious examination of racial attitudes in the military. The obvious lesson that black troops had outperformed white troops at the critical moment was too threatening to white supremacist ideology to be openly acknowledged or addressed. Instead, the focus was on improving militia training, strengthening coastal defenses, building better military infrastructure, all of which were reasonable responses but which avoided confronting the uncomfortable truth about racial performance in combat. Some military leaders, including Captain Porter, did try to advocate for expanded black military service based on what they had witnessed. They argued that black men deserved the opportunity to serve, that they had proven their capabilities under fire, that America was foolish to reject willing and capable soldiers based on skin color. But these arguments ran into the immovable obstacle of American racism, which insisted that black people were inherently inferior and that arming black men was dangerous regardless of military necessity. The result was a continuation of discriminatory policies that kept black military service limited, segregated, and under-recognized for another century and a half. Think about what it meant to stand at that bridge while the world was falling apart around you. You're a black man in 1814 America, which means you're either enslaved and hoping military service will buy your freedom, or you're free and constantly aware that your freedom is tenuous, subject to being challenged or revoked at any moment. You've been given a musket and told to defend a nation that treats you as property or second-class citizen at best. The white soldiers around you, who supposedly share your cause, often regard you with suspicion or contempt. The nation's founding documents speak of liberty and equality, but none of that equality extends to you. You could run. You could throw down your weapon and flee like the militia is doing right now all around you. No one would blame you. Why should you die for a country that denies you humanity? But you don't run. You stand. You load your musket. You aim at the British soldiers advancing toward you. You fire. You reload. You do it again and again and again, even as men fall around you, even as British artillery tears holes in your line, even as the tactical situation becomes increasingly desperate. Why? Maybe because you believe in the promise of America even when America doesn't believe in you. Maybe because you're fighting for the America that could be, not the America that is. Maybe because you know that your actions in this moment will be remembered, will be judged, will be used either to support or deny your humanity and your rights. Maybe because you're tired of running, tired of being less than, tired of accepting that white people get to define your worth and your capabilities. So you stand, you fight, you prove in blood and fire that you are as brave, as capable, as worthy as any man regardless of color. And then history forgets you anyway. The British casualties at Bladensburg are difficult to determine precisely, but historians estimate the British suffered around 250 to 300 casualties in the battle, with a significant portion of those occurring during the fighting at the bridge where Porter's Black Regiment made its stand. For the Americans, total casualties were lower, perhaps 100 to 150, because most American units fled before sustaining significant losses. But Porter's Black Regiment, because they actually stood and fought, likely suffered disproportionately high casualties compared to other American units. They paid in blood for their courage, and their sacrifice bought time that may have saved the American government from capture and the American nation from complete humiliation. In the cruel mathematics of war, their willingness to die rather than flee made them more valuable to American survival than all the militia units that ran away combined, but it also meant they paid the highest price. How many of those black soldiers survived the war? How many won the freedom they were fighting for? How many lived long enough to see their sacrifice acknowledged or remembered? For most of them, we don't even know their names. The historical record is frustratingly incomplete, with few detailed rosters of black units, few personal accounts from black soldiers, few efforts made to preserve their stories for future generations. Let's fast forward to 1815, when the war ended with the Treaty of Ghent. The treaty essentially restored the pre-war status quo. No territory changed hands, no major concessions were made by either side, and on paper it looked like the war had been pointless. But for America, survival was victory. The nation had weathered a full-scale British attempt to destroy it, had endured the burning of its capital, and had emerged as an independent nation that Britain was forced to recognize and respect. American nationalism surged in the post-war years, with a new sense of national identity and confidence. The era of good feelings brought political unity and economic expansion. America turned westward, focused on internal development, and began to see itself as a rising power rather than a fragile experiment. But for Black Americans, the post-war years brought bitter disappointment. The promises of freedom for military service were often broken or contested. The expansion westward meant the expansion of slavery into new territories. The rising American nationalism was explicitly white nationalism, with Black contributions to American survival systematically erased or minimized. The courage displayed at Bladensburg and in countless other actions during the war did not translate into equal rights, into citizenship, into freedom for the enslaved, or into respect for the free Black population. Instead, American racism actually intensified in the decades after the War of 1812, as the cotton economy boomed and the pro-slavery ideology became more entrenched and more extreme. The irony is almost unbearable. At the moment when American independence hung by a thread, when British forces were destroying the symbols of American sovereignty, when white soldiers were fleeing in panic and government officials were abandoning the capital, it was Black men who stood firm, who fought for America when America seemed lost. They defended a nation that enslaved them, protected a government that denied them rights, shed blood for a flag that didn't represent their freedom. And their reward was historical erasure, continued oppression, and a nation that would rather forget their sacrifice than confront what it revealed about the lie at the heart of American democracy. For a nation claiming to be founded on principles of liberty and equality, the treatment of Black veterans who fought in the War of 1812 exposed the bankruptcy of those claims. America wanted Black courage when it was convenient, Black blood when it was necessary, Black sacrifice when it served white interests, but America didn't want to acknowledge Black humanity, Black equality, or Black rights even after that courage and blood and sacrifice had saved the nation. This pattern would repeat throughout American history, becoming a tragic rhythm that defined Black military service for centuries. Black soldiers would fight bravely, would prove themselves repeatedly, would hope each time that their service would finally earn them the equality and respect they deserved. And each time, America would accept their sacrifice while continuing to deny them justice. After the Civil War, Black veterans who had fought to end slavery found themselves facing segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence. After World War I, Black veterans who had fought to make the world safe for democracy returned home to lynchings and race riots. After World War II, Black veterans who had fought against fascism came home to Jim Crow and were often denied the benefits of the GI Bill. After Vietnam, Black veterans who had fought in disproportionate numbers came home to a nation still struggling with civil rights and racial justice. The pattern was set at Bladensburg in 1814, when Black courage couldn't overcome American racism, when Black sacrifice couldn't purchase Black freedom, when Black service couldn't earn Black equality. Every generation of Black veterans since has confronted this same bitter truth. America will use you, will rely on you, will need you, but America will not automatically grant you the justice you've earned through your service. So why does this story matter today, in the 21st century, more than 200 years after that day in August when Washington burned? Because the erasure continues. Because most Americans still don't know about Porter's Black Regiment, still don't know about Black service in the War of 1812, still don't know how often Black courage and Black sacrifice have been written out of the American story. Because we're still fighting about whose history gets told, whose contributions get remembered, whose sacrifices get honored. Because there are people today who want to ban teaching about racial injustice in American history, who want to present a sanitized version of the past that ignores the contributions and struggles of Black Americans, who want to maintain the comfortable lie that America has always been great rather than confronting the uncomfortable truth that America has often failed to live up to its stated ideals. The story of the Black Regiment at Bladensburg is a threat to that sanitized narrative because it reveals both the depths of Black patriotism and courage and the depths of American ingratitude and racism. It's a story that demands we recognize Black agency in American history, that we acknowledge Black people as active participants in creating and defending America rather than passive victims or peripheral figures. It's a story that insists Black history is American history, that you cannot understand American survival and development without understanding Black contributions to that survival and development. The bridge at Bladensburg where Porter's Black Regiment made their stand is still there, though the area around it has changed dramatically. You can visit the Bladensburg battlefield today. It's a national historic site, with markers explaining the battle and its significance. But until recently, those markers said very little about the Black soldiers who fought there, about their crucial role in delaying the British advance, about their courage under fire while white militia fled. That's changing now, slowly, as historians push for more complete and honest public history, as communities demand that historical sites acknowledge all the people who shaped historical events, not just the ones who fit comfortably into preferred narratives. But the change is slow, is contested, is constantly fighting against the urge to present a simpler, whiter, less complicated version of American history. Every historical marker that mentions Black soldiers, every museum exhibit that includes Black voices, every school curriculum that teaches about Black contributions to American survival, all of it has to be fought for, defended, justified against people who think these stories somehow diminish American greatness rather than recognizing that they reveal the full complexity and truth of the American experience. Here's what I want you to understand, what I need you to take away from this story. When Porter's Black Regiment stood at that bridge on August 24, 1814, they weren't just fighting the British. They were fighting for recognition, for dignity, for the chance to prove that Black courage was equal to any white courage, that Black sacrifice mattered, that Black lives had value beyond their labor or their subjugation. They were fighting for a future where their descendants might live as equals, might enjoy the freedom and opportunities that they themselves were denied, might inherit an America that actually lived up to its stated principles. They stood knowing they might die, knowing their sacrifice might not be acknowledged, knowing America might forget them or write them out of the story, and they stood anyway. That's the kind of courage that transcends tactics and military strategy, that speaks to something fundamental about human dignity and resistance and hope. They stood because they refused to accept the limitations that racism tried to impose on them, because they believed in their own worth even when America didn't, because they chose to be heroes even when America wasn't ready to have Black heroes. And the fact that we're only now, more than 2 centuries later, beginning to tell their story accurately and completely, is both a testament to their courage and an indictment of our historical memory. So what do we do with this story? We remember it, first and foremost. We speak their names when we know them, we honor their sacrifice, we teach their story to the next generation. We refuse to let them be erased again, to let their courage be forgotten, to let their contribution to American survival disappear into the convenient amnesia of sanitized history. We connect their story to the ongoing struggle for racial justice, recognizing that the fight they were waging, the fight to be seen as fully human, to be recognized as equal citizens, to have their contributions valued and their rights protected, is the same fight that continues today. We use their story to challenge the comfortable narratives about American history that leave out the hard parts, that skip over the racism and the betrayal and the broken promises. We insist that American history is incomplete without Black history, that you cannot understand America's survival without understanding who fought for that survival even when America didn't fight for them. We remember the bridge at Bladensburg, we remember the Black Regiment that held when everyone else ran, We remember that Washington, D.C. is still the American capital today in part because of black soldiers who refused to let it fall without a fight. This is your history, this is American history. This is the truth that needs to be told and retold until everyone knows it, until it becomes as famous as Paul Revere's Ride or Washington crossing the Delaware, until no one can claim to understand the War of 1812 or American survival or military courage without knowing about the Black Regiment that saved Washington when it was burning.